begin our chapter summary this week talking about transplantations and borderlands. Taft doesn't really understand borders right now because he thinks he's getting more treats. And it looks like he's leaving, and there he goes. Okay, and we're back. Are we ready to start filming now, Taft? Good to hear. Okay, so in this chapter we'll be talking about transplantations in borderlands, transplantations being Europeans and borderlands being the borders between different European settlements and between Europeans and the natives who obviously occupied most of North America. We begin our discussion of the early Chesapeake, and we look at sort of the relationship between the colonists and the natives, and it talks about early problems. What were the problems? Well, essentially the problems were not enough food. I know, I agree. 100%. It's a terrible problem. But basically, the issue was that the settlers who came to the Chesapeake, which is the area that is now Virginia and Maryland, were more concerned about getting gold and not concerned enough about farming properly. And the main issue that they would have was that they didn't have enough food, and if they didn't starve to death, they were oftentimes overworked. Life in early Jamestown was very, very rough. But John Smith was one of the first people to be able to impose order in Jamestown, but he established a rocky relationship with the natives in the process. Sometimes he got along with them, sometimes he kind of screwed them over. It was not exactly a healthy relationship by any stretch of the imagination. So we see lots of reorganization and expansion. There's a period known as the starving time, which is never going to be good. What do you think of starving time, Taft? I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, don't you think? Yeah. Anyway, we have one of our first leaders of the Virginia region, De La Warr, who was very, very harsh. He was very, very brutal in terms of how he dealt with the settlers. Basically, you had to work or you could be tortured, imprisoned, or killed. It was very much my way or the dead way in a lot of ways. But out of this emerged the ability to grow tobacco, which became a huge cash crop coming from the Americas. It was wildly popular in Europe. People started smoking, which is never good. Don't smoke, Taft. It's bad for your cat lungs, and it's bad for your human lungs, kids. But tobacco became very, very popular. A lot of Europeans loved it, though some hated it. Some saw it as a savage practice. And actually, the Europeans sort of got the practice of smoking from the natives, who they noticed kind of were smoking in the same way. However, the issue with the tobacco economy is that tobacco requires a lot of land to grow, and it tends to exhaust the soil quickly, and that's an issue because it's going to cause settlers to have to acquire more and more land, which is going to infringe upon native territory, which is going to invariably lead to conflict. And that's an issue, and it's an issue we'll see going on and on and on throughout this chapter. But with the expansion was a need for new settlers and a need for labor. There was lots of incentives to try to get people to come over. Now Taft is leaving again. He's had enough. And we're back. Someone decided to join us and get over himself and be a co-host. Yeah, that someone's you. But whatever. All right, anyway, back to the early Chesapeake. Expansion required people, and to get people, you have to get people over there, and they had a lot of incentives to do so. One of those was the headright system, which basically gave people money or land if they came over. There was also a big initiative to get women to come over. Now, your book kind of makes a little bit of a misleading statement and said that women were bought. I don't like that statement because that implies that the women were slaves, and they most certainly were not. Women were paid to come over, but they were not bought. Actually, women were given about 120 pounds worth of tobacco to come over, and in today's dollars, that equates to about actually $5,000. They got a free trip across the ocean to get there, and they had to be somebody's wife. And in actuality, they actually got a lot more rights than they would have back in England. So to imply that they're bought is misleading. But also in Virginia, we see the establishment of the House of Burgesses, which essentially was an elected body of landowners in Virginia who decided on issues concerning the colony. However, we also see a huge development in 1619 with the birth of American slavery. About 20 to 30 African slaves were brought on a Dutch ship from what is now modern day Angola. Back then, it didn't raise a huge splash because, again, using slave labor was to become a more and more frequent thing. But this begins the whole institution of slavery, and obviously, from here, it would grow and expand tremendously. And also from here, we see with the growth and expansion of the Virginia colony, we also see conflicts with the natives, which we will see over and over again. One group in particular was the Powhatan tribes, and this is where we see the story of Pocahontas emerge. Now, Pocahontas is not the story you see in the Disney film. That is extremely misleading. Pocahontas did not magically fall in love with John Smith. Rather, she was kidnapped by Virginia settlers and held as a ransom to get her father's tribe to surrender. She was married to John Rolfe when she was about 17 and he was about 29. She had a child with him. She was taken to England where she caught some sort of disease and died. Her story is really not much of a fairy tale at all, despite what the movie may say. However, because of the kidnapping of his daughter as well as the recognition that he was heavily outgunned, Powhatan's tribes actually surrendered and tried to make peace with the natives in Virginia. The Virginia Company would actually go bankrupt as the profitability of it didn't come to fruition for quite a few years. They just couldn't make money. So actually the Royal Crown took over it under the rule of King James. The growth of the early Chesapeake was massive from the outstart in terms of the non-native population. And notice in this graph how much the growth of the use of slaves increases in the latter part of the 17th century. It increases tremendously as this institution is seen more and more and more as an essential institution for the growth and foundation of what would eventually be the American Republic. This couldn't have occurred without the exchange of agricultural technology between natives and the settlers. They had to exchange techniques in terms of making this work, in terms of the natives teaching the settlers how to grow things like corn and that sort of thing so that they could sustain their population. Then we move over to Maryland, which was established by the Calverts. The Calverts were Catholic, and we'll see a lot of rivalry between Catholics and Protestants at this time. But he is the first Lord Baltimore, which is sort of a noble title he sort of came up with to make him sound more noble and royal. Remember, being royal was a big thing back then. To sound like a noble was a big thing because this is still, in a lot of ways, the age of absolutism in Europe, that is, absolute rule of monarchs. To get more people to arrive in Maryland, though, they had to become more tolerant and become a place that didn't just allow Catholics to come, but Protestants as well. That's what the Act Concerning Religion was all about. But then we see in Virginia a massively important development in terms of not only the development of Virginia, but the development of what would become the United States. As Virginia expanded westward and became more turbulent because of that, in addition to William Berkeley's autocratic rule over Virginia, we see a rebellion take place led by Nathaniel Bacon. Taft. What do you think of that name, Nathaniel Bacon? I think it's pretty kick butt. What was that? You said something. I don't know what it was, but you said something. And I'm going to figure it out. Anyway, Nathaniel Bacon was a landowning Virginia backcountry farmer who had a lot of grievances against the rule of William Berkeley. He felt that their needs were not being well represented, and one of the big grievances he didn't feel that Berkeley was aggressive enough against the natives, which inhibited backcountry farmers from gaining wealth. Not only that, but the House of Burgesses, he felt he was underrepresented there. And so he led a rebellion against Berkeley's rule in which the city of Jamestown was actually burned to the ground, and a rebellion was very, very tumultuous for the hierarchy of Virginia. And what was very noticeable about this and was very significant about Bacon's rebellion is that his rebellion included not only backcountry farmers, but also poor whites and also African slaves. And this really, really freaked out the land-owning gentry in Virginia. It freaked them out so much that they had to reconsider what their labor source would be. You have to realize back then that the use of slavery was not necessarily seen as the way to handle labor. And there were a lot of people who felt that it was better to use sort of white wage indentured servant labor. Indentured servants are people who basically come over to the Americas for free, and the assumption is that they work for a while for a farmer, and then eventually, after they've worked for whatever contract they signed said they had to work, they were given a piece of land and set free. Well, they began to really worry about what would happen if these two groups came together. And famed historian Ronald Takaki makes the assertion that this was the start of systemic racism as we know it in American society. And it was a response by the ruling class of the Virginians to ensure that the lower classes would be forever divided and thus couldn't get together to threaten the existing class structure. And one thing we will see is the growth of the use of Africans as a labor force in the South, rather than whites, rather than natives. They didn't like to use whites because they were worried that if they used too many of them, they might rebel, and also it was a lot easier for whites to escape and perhaps shirk their duties. They didn't want to use natives because it was really easy for natives to escape and go off and join other native tribal groups. Africans were the ones because they stood out, because they were legally slaves, and because they looked different. They were a lot easier to control, especially if you're giving the marginalized poor white class a little bit of an incentive to keep the Africans in their place. And we will see this be used over and over in the South, in which wealthy white planters and landowners will use poor whites as a means of sort of controlling the African slaves and maintaining the racial hierarchy. And that brings us to New England, which is the areas that are what are now Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. I might be forgetting one, but those are essentially the main ones. Unlike in Virginia, the main reason for their settlement was religious. In Plymouth, which is basically what is now Massachusetts, they were started by what came to be known as Puritans, but started as Scrooby separatists. Scrooby is an area in England. They first went over to the Netherlands, where they weren't quite happy there. Their relations with the natives, at first were quite benevolent, and the natives actually kind of took care of them. Think of the first Thanksgiving, which is basically a feast after the first harvest, and that allowed the Puritans to actually function in terms of a society that could actually eat. It wasn't easy at first, but they did manage to figure it out. Their first leader was William Bradford, who led for quite some time and was in many ways seen as almost kind of a dictator in a lot of ways. And the Puritan experiment was religious. They wanted to build a sort of utopian religious society. And we'll see this sort of idea of utopian religious societies emerge again and again, especially in the early days of the colonies, but later on, around in the Industrial Revolution. Massachusetts Bay Colony would be in what is centralized around the city of Boston and kind of the surrounding areas. And John Winthrop, one of the early leaders, would initially try to establish the area as an Anglican area, as in part of the Church of England, but would eventually break off from the Anglican Church, even though they didn't really intend to. He would try to establish his Puritan colony as a city upon a hill. The idea that it is a city on a hill, it is better than all of the other ones, and it's the best place in the world. Taft, what do you think of the city on a hill? That's a strange thought, and it doesn't make sense. And you're distracting people. And you need to stop. But anyway, they established what is essentially a theocratic society. Theocratic meaning it's ruled by religion. There really is no separation of church and state in the Massachusetts Bay Company. Religious leaders are also the political leaders, and essentially if you are not a part of their religious group, you are not a part of their society or accepted. So as the region of New England expands, there also is growing religious dissent, as not everybody agrees with John Winthrop and the Puritans' idea of how to run a place. And one of those dissenters is Roger Williams, who did not agree with the Pilgrim way of life and wanted to have a different sort of Puritan way of life, and he establishes a colony in what is now Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson would be a leading female voice against the rule of John Winthrop, and out of this dissension grows the colonies of New Hampshire and Spain, which is actually one colony, and they would separate later on in the 1800s. Again, we see the importance of native assistance in New England. Without the assistance of natives, especially in terms of gathering agricultural goods, the native or the experience of settlers probably would have been a failure. It makes one wonder if the natives hadn't helped the settlers, maybe the settlers wouldn't have succeeded and the natives could have sustained their way of life. It's an interesting to look at. But we see the attitude shift in which this sort of mutually beneficial relationship becomes less and less mutually beneficial as the settlers expand westward, take over native lands, and conflicts ensue. Actually, Anne Hutchinson would die because of a conflict with the natives. That brings us more to the issue of conflict with natives. We have two major wars, the Pequot War and King Philip's War, which is also known as Metacomet's War. But both of those are conflicts with the natives between New England. And in both of those, we see the settlers very successful in fighting off the natives, mostly because of superior arms. They had better technology, they had better weapons. One of those would be the flintlock musket, which was a much more effective musket than they had before, they being the settlers. They were far more effective at using that. It loaded much more easily, and it was a lot more easy to carry around. And that brings us to what are known as the Restoration colonies. And before we get into the colonies itself, we have to get into what the Restoration was all about. Long story short, England had a civil war. They had a revolution. There was a big conflict between King Charles and Parliament in terms of who was to be in charge. Charles kind of wanted to be more authoritarian. Parliament wanted to have their own rights and an ability to rule England. Parliament is essentially kind of the Congress of England, except back then it wasn't elected people, it was nobles. There was a big civil war between two groups known as the Cavaliers, who supported the monarchy, and the Roundheads, who supported the Parliament. The Roundheads won. Charles I was beheaded, and an actual non-King of England ruled. He ruled the Commonwealth, and his name was Oliver Cromwell. He ruled for the better part of a decade until he died. He gave the rule of England to his son, who proved to be ineffective, and the monarchy was able to reinstall itself under the guise of the Stuart dynasty. That's a lot of European history stuff. Just know that England had a civil war. There was a crisis of leadership. There was no king, and then there was a king. With the restoration of the king, they needed to restore their power, and a way to do that was to restore their colonies in the Americas. And the way to do that was to reward those who were loyal to the king throughout this entire period of the Civil War with colonies in the Americas. And those colonies would be the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. All were rewarded to faithful member of the Royal Stuart Court. Starting with the Carolinas, again, we see the incentives for settlement in which they had to try to lure people over to settle and establish farms. Anthony Ashley Cooper was one of the only successful proprietary settlers of the Carolinas. He was one of the only ones who was able to turn a profit. The king split the Carolinas, though, after years of crisis and tension between the two. It was too unstable to keep it as one. The people in the South had a close tie with the Caribbean colonies and had a lot of trade there. And eventually, the north and south part of Carolina split, and those states are still split to this day. And that brings us to the New Netherlands, New York, and New Jersey. The New Netherlands, aka New Amsterdam, would become New York. There was a rival between the British and the Dutch, especially in North America, but throughout the world. They fought, and eventually New Amsterdam was seized by British forces. The governor, Peter Stuyvesant, and actually a part of New York, a part of Brooklyn, is still called Stuyvesant, Bedford Stuyvesant, Bed-Stuy for short, surrendered surrendered New Amsterdam to the British and it became New York. Both were former colonies owned by the British monarchy, that is New York and New Jersey. New York had a much better harbor and a very powerful landowning class, whereas New Jersey didn't. They had mostly small farmers. Moving us along to the Quaker colonies, which would eventually become Pennsylvania. Quakers is a different kind of religious sect in England. They're Christian, but they worship in a different way. They're called Quakers because their founder, George Fox, urged people to tremble at the name of the Lord. And Quakers are also pacifists, meaning they do not fight under any circumstances, which has oftentimes made them unpopular with those around them. Taft, what do you think of pacifism? Well, I think you need to chill. Anyway, William Penn got Pennsylvania because, and guess what, he named it after himself. He got Pennsylvania because he was a member of a wealthy English family that owned a lot of land and was owed a lot of money by King Charles II. Remember, he was loyal to the monarchy throughout the Civil War period. Charles didn't have any money to repay him, and rather than give him money, he gave him the area that became Pennsylvania. For a long time, Penn ruled with absolute power, but the people from the south part of Pennsylvania didn't really feel that he was listening to them, so they pressured him into a representative assembly, and eventually the South would eventually become the state of Delaware, colony of Delaware first, of course. And that brings us to the topic of borderlands and middle grounds. Borderlands being the areas surrounding what would eventually become the colonies, and middle grounds being areas between the colonies and between the colonies and the borders. We'll start with the Caribbean islands. Remember that England was a massively growing empire throughout the world, and they had a lot of land in the Caribbean. And lands in the Caribbean were primarily profitable through the growth of sugarcane, which is instrumental in obviously the production of sugar, which is the stuff we put in food, but also in the production of rum, which is an alcoholic liquor that becomes wildly popular during this time, and also molasses, which is this sort of syrupy liquid that you also use to put on top of a lot of food. But to grow sugar, it is very labor intensive, and of course they used slaves at this time. And the reason they used African slaves in the Caribbean was because they tried to use English wage workers, but they found that the English people they brought over were terrible workers because the climates were so different. They couldn't bring these pasty white dudes from England over to the Caribbean and expect them to work in the sun all day and not die. So they brought over Africans because they were much more suited to that climate and found themselves to be a lot better workers. And we see a lot of imperial conflict within this area too. When you think of stories like the Pirates of the Caribbean and other sort of seafaring tales of adventure and swashbuckling, this is the area we're talking about. And most pirates did not really operate on their own. They operated for a country. They were called privateers in the English. And basically they can go rob and kill and pillage all of the ships they want as long as they weren't English, especially if they attacked Spanish ships, because that's what England really wanted, was the Spanish Empire to fall apart. Huge rivalry then. So in case you're keeping track at home, so far England doesn't like Spain and they don't like the Dutch either. Guess what? They're not going to like the French either. Just could not get along, those European countries. But back to the Caribbean, the image of slavery in the Caribbean is a bit different than the one we typically associate with the Americas, in that it was a lot more cruel. Slave revolts were a lot more common, and the big reason for that is that the societies are far more unstable because there were way more slaves than there were masters. When you have this huge imbalance and a ton of slaves and not very masters, the idea to revolt becomes a lot more apparent because it's a lot more you're able to succeed a lot better. So there's a lot more unrest in this area. But there is a big connection to British North America, is that a lot of the goods made in the Caribbean came to the Americas, and a lot of the slaves who were brought over to the Americas would go to the Caribbean first after they were stolen from Africa. And that gets us to the southwestern borderland, which is controlled by Spain. It's important to know that obviously Spain clashed with Britain, but these areas were far more developed than the areas in North America controlled by the British. Remember that the Spanish had a much greater head start than the British did. They started establishing their colonies well into the 1500s, and a lot of these places were very, very settled and very urban by this time. In fact, the oldest university in the Americas is in Mexico City. It's not Harvard, it's in Mexico City. But places like California would be important borderlands, especially in Florida. And the southeastern borderlands would become intense areas of hostility as the Spanish had desires to move up the Atlantic coast and take over what the British had, and the British had the desire to do the same to the Spanish, but in Florida. And that leads us to the founding of Georgia. Georgia was first founded as a military installation under the rule of James Oglethorpe, who was a British general. He had this idea of not allowing large land holdings because he worried that it would rival sort of his whole thing. He wanted to have a military state, a military colony in which everybody sort of lived to sort of defend the rest of the colonies from Spanish invasion from the south. He also didn't allow African slaves as he was worried that that would lead to insurrections. He didn't allow Catholics, rum, or democracy. All of those things were seen as undermining the military state of Georgia. There were a few military failures, though, especially when he tried to conquer St. Augustine, that is James Oglethorpe. He failed to do that, and a lot of people sort of saw that failure along with their inability to have democratic society, an inability to practice Catholicism, an inability to import African slaves or drink rum, and started to think, maybe we should do something different. So Oglethorpe lightened up a little bit and allowed slavery and rum, but then he had to relinquish control to the Crown of England, and they gave the colony the ability to have an elected assembly. And that brings us to the idea of the Middle Grounds as being an interesting place in terms of how it related with the natives. There was a lot of conflict, but there was also a lot of accommodation. Though that they fought a lot, there was also many instances in which the English kind of figured out that the way to deal with the natives and the way to negotiate with the natives was complicated, and the idea of land ownership was not necessarily something the natives practiced. And so they learned how to embrace the idea of ritual and gift giving as a way of sort of achieving balance within these areas. And that brings us to our last section, which is the evolution of the British Empire. There was a huge drive for the reorganization of the British Empire, especially after the Civil War period. Remember, mercantilism was king, the idea of going off and establishing colonies and bringing those raw materials back to the mother country to sell them and make money. Well, that doesn't really work if the people in your colonies are selling their goods to other countries. If you have your British subjects in North America selling their goods to countries like Spain or the Netherlands, that's England losing money, and they couldn't have that. So they enacted a set of laws called the Navigation Acts, which basically forbade the colonists from selling their goods to any other country besides England. But the issue with that is that if you're going to make that law, you have to enforce it. A law that is not enforced, it's not a law. It's a mere suggestion. Right, Taft? You have to have laws. Otherwise, we're just godless creatures like yourself who only listen to themselves and do whatever they want, even when you're trying to film a show for your AP class. You sinner. You layabout. Anyway, so that caused the British to put tighter control and tighter restrictions on the colony. And that meant more officials coming over, more regulations, and more people trying to enforce the rules. And that brings us to our second to last slide, which is on the Dominion of New England. England tried to take the New England colonies and combine them all into one and have them ruled by one single person named Sir Edmund Andros, who was actually a relatively capable administrator, but by all accounts a very tactless man. He just didn't know how to act. But that also might be something said by people who didn't like them. They eventually, the places of New England and New York, New Jersey, basically were combined under one government. They didn't like it. They rebelled, and Edmund Andros was removed, and essentially New England was established as it was before. We also see a revolution in Baltimore by John Cootie, probably butchering his name, to drive out the Catholic Lord Baltimore and establish a more representative assembly. And that would eventually fail as well. Now, why did these rebellions occur? Well, because there was another revolution in England, even though they had a civil war not too long before, in which you had a Catholic monarch in England was wildly unpopular because England for a long time was Protestant. People didn't like them, and they got one of his kids, Mary, to come back from England with her husband, the William of Orange, and they basically sort of got him out of the picture peacefully, and they began to rule England as joint sovereigns. The reason it's called a glorious revolution is that nobody had to fight, nobody had to die. But during this time, a lot of the colonies saw this as their opportunity to take more power and to take more sovereignty for themselves. It worked for a little bit, but William and Mary proved capable at sort of regaining power and control over the colonies at this time for England. Now, during this whole time, it's important to note, and I cannot stress this enough, is that as the colonies are growing, the use of African slave labor grows as well. And the growth and foundation of these colonies are built on African slave labor. And more people begin to normalize Africans as slaves, the more they begin to normalize Africans as not a part of the society. Even though Africans are literally working their whole lives to build this society, they will never get to enjoy. And we will see this foundation become more and more apparent and more solidified, and it's something we still experience today when a lot of the racial unrest we experience in this country today are rooted on this uneven and broken foundation we see rooted back in the 17th century as the English colonies are built on the backs of slave laborers. That's all we have this week for our chapter outline. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget, keep pushing, G. Why are you so lazy?